It's often misunderstood that people who crave deep conversations are just overthinkers, socially awkward, or trying to sound intelligent. That misunderstanding does real damage. It labels curiosity as intensity. It makes emotional depth look like a burden. And over time, people who genuinely long for meaningful dialogue start shrinking themselves to fit into surface-level spaces. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They nod at conversations that go nowhere. And they slowly feel lonelier in rooms full of people. The truth is, loving deep conversations isn't a personality quirk. It's a psychological orientation toward meaning. Let's talk about what that really means. Why small talk feels emotionally expensive to them. For someone who loves depth, small talk isn't harmless. It's draining. Not because they think they're above it, but because their nervous system isn't stimulated by surface-level exchanges. When conversation stays at the level of weather, gossip, or rehearsed social scripts, their brain doesn't light up. Research on personality traits, particularly openness to experience, shows that some individuals are neurologically wired to seek complexity, abstraction, and novelty. They're not trying to complicate things. Their minds naturally gravitate toward underlying patterns, motivations, and contradictions. They don't just want to know what happened. They want to know why it happened, what it meant, and how it changed someone. When they're stuck in repetitive, predictable exchanges, it creates a subtle form of social boredom. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that makes them feel slightly disconnected from the moment. That's why you'll often see them disengage, go quiet, or redirect the conversation towards something more reflective. And here's where people misunderstand them. Silence isn't disinterest, it's understimulation. They associate intimacy with intellectual and emotional depth. For people who love deep conversations, intimacy isn't built through frequency, it's built through revelation. They feel close to someone when vulnerabilities are shared, when contradictions are explored, when uncomfortable truths are examined without judgment. A 2-hour conversation about fears, childhood dynamics, existential doubts, or moral dilemmas can bond them faster than months of casual interaction. This isn't romanticism, it's attachment psychology. Some individuals form bonds primarily through shared activities, others bond through shared emotional exposure. Depth seekers often fall into the second category. They experience trust when someone allows complexity to be seen. When someone says, "This is who I am, even the messy parts," and stays. If you've ever noticed that you feel strangely close to someone after one honest late-night conversation, you've experienced this dynamic. It's not about time spent. It's about psychological transparency. They're not trying to analyze you, they're trying to understand you. There's a common accusation deep conversationalists hear. Why are you overanalyzing everything? What's really happening is pattern recognition. The human brain is built to make sense of behavior. Some people stop at observable facts. Others instinctively trace behavior back to belief systems, fears, values, and early conditioning. They're not interrogating you. They're mapping meaning. In fact, this tendency aligns closely with what psychologist Carl Jung described as individuation, the drive to understand the deeper layers of the self beyond surface identity. While Jung's theories are often oversimplified online, one idea remains powerful. People differ in how much they orient toward the unconscious and symbolic dimensions of life. Depth lovers lean into that. They're curious about your contradictions. They want to know why you reacted strongly to something minor. They notice inconsistencies in their own behavior and yours, not to criticize, but to make sense of them. Of course, this can become intrusive if not regulated. Emotional intelligence is knowing when depth is invited and when it's not. But the motivation, at its core, is understanding, not control. They often felt misunderstood growing up. Many people who crave deep conversations learned early that surface-level interaction didn't feel safe or satisfying. Sometimes they grew up in environments where emotions were intense but unspoken. Sometimes they were the child who asked why too many times. Sometimes they were told they were too sensitive or too serious. So they developed an internal world rich with analysis and reflection. They learned to process internally because external conversations didn't meet them there. This is important. Loving deep conversations is often a response to earlier emotional deprivation or misattunement. When you don't feel deeply understood, you become deeply interested in understanding. That doesn't make it pathological. It makes it adaptive. And later in life, when they find someone who can finally meet them at that level, it feels profound. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're finally seen in the language they speak. They are comfortable with psychological discomfort. Depth requires discomfort. You cannot talk about mortality, insecurity, regret, resentment, moral failure, or existential confusion without brushing against vulnerability. Many people avoid these topics because they trigger anxiety. Depth seekers don't necessarily enjoy discomfort, but they tolerate it. There's a strong overlap here with what researchers call emotional granularity, the ability to differentiate and articulate subtle emotional states. People who engage in deeper conversations often have higher emotional granularity. They can distinguish between disappointment and shame, between loneliness and rejection, between anger and betrayal. Because they can name internal states with nuance, they're less afraid of discussing them. And this makes them powerful conversational partners, not because they dominate dialogue, but because they create space for complexity without panicking. They care about meaning more than social performance. Many social interactions are performances: polite smiles, strategic laughter, curated opinions. Most people navigate this effortlessly. But depth-oriented individuals often experience a quiet resistance to excessive performance. They're sensitive to inauthenticity, not in a judgmental way, but in a visceral way. When conversation feels scripted, they feel disconnected. This aligns with self-determination theory, particularly the psychological need for authenticity and relatedness. When interactions lack sincerity, those needs aren't met. So they steer conversations toward real opinions, real doubts, real values. They'll ask what you actually think about something controversial. They'll question cultural norms. They'll explore identity beyond labels, not to provoke, to anchor the interaction in something real. They're not always extroverts, but they're not necessarily introverts either. Another myth is that only introverts love deep conversations. That's inaccurate. Introversion relates to energy restoration, not conversational depth. There are highly social, charismatic individuals who crave philosophical or emotionally layered discussions. And there are introverts who prefer quiet simplicity over analysis. What predicts love for deep conversation more reliably is openness to experience, and in some cases, higher trait empathy. People high in empathy are naturally attuned to internal states, their own and others. That attunement makes depth feel natural. But here's the nuance. Loving deep conversation doesn't mean you're always serious. Many depth seekers are playful, humorous, even lighthearted. They just don't want to live only on the surface. They want range. Why do some people, sometimes struggle in modern social culture? Well, modern social culture really rewards speed and brevity, quick replies, short-form content, rapid exchanges, and of course these highly curated public personas. But depth takes time. It requires pauses. It actually tolerates silence. It unfolds gradually. And in environments that are just dominated by distraction, depth can honestly feel out of place. People who crave it may feel chronically undernourished socially, not because they lack interaction, but because the interaction just, well, lacks substance. This can lead to a kind of subtle loneliness, the kind where you're surrounded by people but rarely understood. And when someone finally engages in a sustained, thoughtful exchange, it feels almost relieving, like finally exhaling. There's a real risk of mistaking intensity for compatibility. Here's where we really need to be honest. People who love deep conversations are vulnerable to mistaking conversational chemistry for relational compatibility. You can have extraordinary intellectual or emotional dialogue with someone who is fundamentally misaligned with your values, boundaries, or even your life direction. Depth can create a powerful illusion of closeness. Shared vulnerability just accelerates bonding. And actually, neuroscience supports this. But accelerated bonding doesn't guarantee stability. If you're someone who craves depth, it's important to learn to differentiate between psychological stimulation and long-term compatibility. One feeds your mind, the other sustains your life. Both really matter, but they are not the same. So, how do you cultivate healthier, deep conversations? If you resonate with this orientation, there are, honestly, some practical adjustments that can make your depth an asset, rather than a liability. First, develop sensitivity to timing. Not every setting is designed for existential exploration. Depth works best when it's mutually invited. Second, balance inquiry with self-disclosure. Deep conversation is reciprocal. If you ask someone to open up, it's important to model that openness yourself. Third, accept that not everyone processes verbally. Some people think through action, silence, or even humor. Depth doesn't have to look like intense dialogue every single time. It can look like shared presence. And finally, don't shame yourself for wanting meaning. Psychological hunger is real. Some people crave novelty, some crave security, some crave intensity, and, yeah, some crave depth. Know yours. In the end, loving deep conversations isn't really about being profound. It's about being oriented toward truth. It's about wanting to understand what drives behavior instead of just reacting to it. It's about caring how experiences shape identity. It's about asking better questions of yourself and others. And in a world increasingly optimized for speed and surface, that orientation is not a weakness. It's a discipline. If this resonated with you, you're probably someone who values insight over noise. Subscribe to It's All Psychological if you want conversations that respect your intelligence and your curiosity. Share this video with someone who always says, "Let's go deeper," and help build a space where understanding human behavior isn't a trend, it's a commitment.